sure that what you think your infrastructure represents is actually the case. And what we've seen is cases like the Ukraine, although that was geopolitical and motivated by that, but the prowess is important to understand, and the techniques. And these techniques are pretty much similar regardless of your industry. Social engineering, your people. Your people are your first line of defense. If you don't train them well enough, then how do you expect them to understand when they're getting an email that asks them to click on something that reports to be appropriate? And what we've seen is technology can help so far, but you've got to train your people how to deal with this in this situation. So in Ukraine, they were attacked twice in 2015 and 2016. The nature of what they did actually showed that the actors are very, not necessarily smart, but they think like a business would, right? So if they don't have the skills to do certain techniques, there are hackers as a service out there, right? So there's new business models out there to make this king. And what we've seen is that they target people because there's a wealth of information on the internet to tell you who are in your organizations. They send them an email, call it phishing, or whaling, depending on how high you run an organization. And through that, they map your network. They go through. Why? Because networks are porous. And what you think is working is not necessarily strong enough. And so in the Ukraine case, they were even better because they had their outcome in mind. They wanted disruption. They wanted to prove the point politically and whoever that aggressor may have been considered. And what they did was not only did they focus on the technology, they focused on the business process. So they looked at your effective 911 calls, and they DOSed them. So effectively, they made sure that that service could not respond by absolutely flooding it with illegitimate requests, denial of service. We're going to see more of that. So legitimate customers couldn't ring and say, I have a problem. At the same time, they targeted the UPS, which is the electronic backup system, which, you know, if you had a situation as you would have planned in your business continuity, you would effectively turn on your UPS to give you some, you know, maybe it's 20 minutes, 24 hours. But they knocked that out and rewrote it, given how much they were able to penetrate. And then they did their basic damage. Now, effectively, it was out for 24 hours, but the impact in winter, in a very cold winter part of the world, has a huge implication. But those are scenarios you should be planning for, right? And then you have my favorite target, which is a retail outlet. And what that points to, which, by the way, they had to pay out about 47 million US as a result of the settlement of very significant information that was compromised, credit card details, personal information. And that was a 47 million US settlement, but it cost them $202 million in legal fees to get to that point. Now we have statistics that show that effectively when something happens in your network, and we call it a cyber incident, it's going to take you approximately on average 191 days to even contain it. To identify it, 191 days, 200 plus days to contain it if you've got the right tools and people. And then to clean it up, it's, you know, even longer. And mostly it's third parties that are going to tell you something's going wrong. And that's what we found in a lot of these cases. And so what we're finding is that these situations are pointing to attackers are getting very smart around understanding your business process. They are not experts, but there's information out there that they can grab. So this is not esoteric. The other one to note is the convergence of cyber and in a physical sense. So the Port of Antwerp in 2013 showed that the convergence of crime is now moving to digital. So they're using digital means to affect a lot of this. And what we're seeing is in that specific case, which really is a wake-up call for national security more broadly, is that the criminal element that is normal in our society and has been for many years, previous one, basically use the same techniques. They phished the staff members. They then understood the routes. They were able to reroute the trucks, which were carrying so-called bananas, but effectively they used it for drug smuggling to get it through the ports. By the time the port authorities had worked it out, they'd already smuggled the equipment and the illicit materials. So what I'm saying is that some of these scenarios are things that you would be planning for normally. It's just cyber is the means. What I kind of want to point to is the next slide, and that was the slide about the car. And I just wanted to point out that this is not just about critical infrastructure. As a startup, you may think that it takes so much cost to affect really basic security hygiene because you've got to get to market, you've got to get your customers. That's fine, that's a market failure in our industry at the moment because our means is actually not that simple, and in some cases it does slow you down. So you may not feel the impact of not having the right cyber or appropriate reasonable security for your customers and your brand and your services. But once you want to scale, and assuming you're not looking in a regulated industry, but once you want to scale, that's where it's becoming a life and death situation for startups, right? Because you're competing with established industries and they're enforcing and requiring you to have more need. This sort of diagram, and I'll stop here, is really what I wanted to point out, the complexity of transformation and innovation. And this is an opportunity for us to think about cybersecurity and applying it a little bit more holistically. And it's an ecosystem approach, so you're not alone. You're not the only one needing to do this, but you've got to think of yourself as part of a broader chain. And if you think about the humble car, which in my mind, from an R&D perspective, is actually going to be your next endpoint, the next mobile phone. We are putting so many services in there. It's going to drive itself one day if we get the safety right. It's got all these little sensors on there that effectively are mini computers. And we've proven on a very simple scale, and yes, it was at a technical conference, that effectively, you know, you've got multiple suppliers that it takes to run a car. Some that are providing audio and entertainment. That security is not their basics. And yet we were able to show that because they don't consider the basic security, that is a means to take over a car. And in the last 3 years, this is where I think we've actually had a little bit more understanding. We were able to show safety and security actually converge. And in this case, by just looking at some of the audio, you can take over the car and stop it on a highway or redirect it. So if we're moving to autonomous systems, whether it's in your factory floor, on highways, in your communities, these things are the things you need to think about. And it's complex because it's an ecosystem that's going to need to get you there. It's not you alone. And yet we're thinking that these things are actually going to be communicating on highways that are also going to be smart. So there's data, there's your private data as a driver. Or maybe, you know, if you end up selling this car, how do you wipe it? How do you wipe it for your fingerprints, right? So it's going to change licensing, it's going to change a whole bunch of things. It's also going to change insurance. How do you insure for this, right? Are you going to move from your fixed and annuity programming to a more real-time assessment of risk? But also, if you think about the fact that ultimately the future is data and software driven. Software is lines of code. Now this car alone has over 100 million lines of code that's going to take to run. Some of your businesses are somewhere in that same vicinity or a fraction of. It's inherently vulnerable. We have not solved the problem of secure software, and we are still trying to affect that. If you've got 100 million lines of code, which by the way, in a car is more than a 747, Boeing shocked me by that, but it's more than 100 million lines of code. How do you get confidence that there's not something in that code that someone is going to find out before you do and actually affect the problem, right? This is complex. That's not saying that we shouldn't embrace technology and digital transformation, but we need to be thinking about this as an ecosystem. So I'm going to stop there because I can keep going. But anyway, over to you.
Thank you. Frank, did you want to perhaps then look at the question and the risks that we just discussed from a global perspective and how they're being addressed? Do you have a slide?
No, but I've had enough coffee that I'm going to take the opportunity to say that's okay with everybody. So I'll try to share a few general observations about the national, but also the international context in which this sort of scenario and some of the risks that Daniella has highlighted are likely to play out. Basically, what would happen organizationally, institutionally, at a national level after the flash and bang of Ashley's scenario. Perhaps some of my comments will be controversial, so you can blame them or discount them on the fact that I'm American. Hopefully I can avoid making a total ass of myself as some other prominent Americans. But my nationality is probably fitting here because Australia initially copied the United States in its approach to how it was going to provide, and more broadly, how it was going to think about cybersecurity, dating back really into the early 1990s. The U.S. approach, I think, can be characterized in sort of three ways. It's largely decentralized, it's primarily voluntary, and it's primarily private. So the norm that we've adopted is that security in this domain is individual or an organization's responsibility. In short, you're on your own in cyberspace. That's true for us as individuals, and that's true for your company. We've come to take this norm for granted, but if you take a second and take a step back, it's actually quite remarkable. National governments have historically played a prominent, if not dominant, role in providing security as a public good in every other domain of operation: land, sea, air, even space. This is true for everything from public health to road safety. It's perhaps especially true in Australia, which is sometimes even goes so far as to being accused of being a nanny state, but not in cyberspace, not for cyber risks. At least not for decades after the internet was invented and became an increasingly prominent avenue through which many of these threats and vulnerabilities have become manifest. The assumption was that the market would provide, right? That individuals would take the necessary steps to protect themselves, organizations would as well, government agencies individually would likewise follow suit. Now, this assumption I don't want to suggest was all bad, but it has proven to be largely inaccurate, both in the United States and elsewhere. So in Australia, the early decision to really imitate the United States, and as a result, underinvest in the government's knowledge and capacity to help provide cybersecurity, has proven consequential. And I'd like to flag two of those consequences, and we can examine some more during Q&A if you like. The first consequence is that by mimicking the United States' approach to providing cybersecurity, Australia's cybersecurity strategy now depends heavily on public-private partnerships, a term that we've probably all heard. As all of you know, most of critical infrastructure in the energy sector and elsewhere is held privately. This wasn't always the case in terms of network infrastructure, but it certainly is the case now. So in order to provide any semblance of cybersecurity, government, from that perspective, has to work with industry. It's a non-starter to try to do it alone. And likewise, unless industry believes it is entirely self-sufficient, it must work with government in order to address some of the broader ecosystem aspects that Daniella has already highlighted. Now, the good news here is that there are some synergies to be gained through these public-private partnerships. Government is actually good at some tasks. Industry, private sector, is good at other tasks. So both can benefit from working together. The bad news is, though, that simply saying public-private partnership or we'll capture synergies doesn't necessarily make it so. I'd suggest to you this morning that effective public-private partnerships are somewhat similar to world peace, very highly desirable but extraordinarily elusive. Even within critical infrastructure, even within the delivery of a public utility or a utility such as electricity, private interests do not necessarily align or equal to the government interest or perhaps even the public good at large. In addition to these divergent interests, cooperation, even when you want to work together, cooperation is difficult because it often requires some degree of sacrifice, even when there are overarching synergies to be gained. Unfortunately, I'd suggest that despite some of its other notable strengths, Australia's current cybersecurity strategy tends to gloss over these differences, tends to gloss over these potential problems of public-private partnerships. And I think it's potentially dangerous to simply assume that industry and government will hold hands and play nice together during a crisis, particularly when push comes to shove and there are real costs involved. Unlike Australia, I think the UK is beginning to recognize, and its cybersecurity strategy is beginning to reflect this inconvenient truth. And the UK is accepting that government will play a more muscular role in the future. Now, whether or not the British have identified a good solution to this problem, I think recognizing the problem is at least a first and important step to progress. And Australia may risk whistling past the graveyard on this critical point. Second consequence for Australia's approach to really incident response in this domain is that all roads lead to the Australian Signals Directorate, right? Now, let me preface this by saying I'm not a hater, not particularly an Edward Snowden fanboy, but the ASD is an intelligence organization. Its mission is to collect their secrets and protect our own. And this one-way flow of information is almost antithetical to what we think of as the information sharing that's necessary for cooperation in a multi-stakeholder environment. Information on malicious capabilities, information on cyber attacks, flow of information from, say, government to industry players and the public more generally. That is very hard for an intelligence agency which is really focused on clandestine collection. Not the intelligence agency's fault, it's just part of built into its design. So this one-way flow of information makes it difficult for the information sharing that we think is increasingly necessary in this space. I think it also helps explain why the ASD was actually quite slow to recognize the importance of cybersecurity and really get involved in this domain. Like its American cousin, the National Security Agency, it was really locked into continuing to fight much of the Cold War well into the 1990s and arguably beyond in terms of its focus on signals intelligence as opposed to this more diverse and dynamic domain. So why depend on the ASD, given the sort of this dubious fit between this intelligence agency and protecting critical infrastructure? The simple answer is probably that having failed or at least chosen not to invest in civilian government capabilities for providing cybersecurity for decades, ASD increasingly looks like the only, or at least the best last option, right? This outcome wasn't inevitable, but it is consequential. To illustrate this point, I'd recommend that you read or look through the review of the e-census incident, if you haven't already. I think it beautifully documents how the Australian Bureau of Statistics turned to the ASD for help as concerns about flow of traffic around census night began to emerge. Turned to ASD for help that the ASD was not in a position to provide. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics wasn't alone. IBM indirectly did the same thing. So IBM turned to the Australian Federal Police, which turned to CERT Australia, which turned to the ASD. So, over-reliance on the ASD may make this intelligence agency a single-point failure in the ecosystem for providing cybersecurity domestically. It also creates some serious, or at least potentially consequential challenges in the event of armed conflict, right? So, whether we like it or not, the ASD is a legitimate military target for a hostile nation or adversary attacking what is in effect what was previously called the Defense Signals Intelligence Directorate or agency, is legitimate. By accident or design, then, the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure and other aspects of civilian cybersecurity in Australia then depends upon an organization that is squarely within the crosshairs of hostile foreign governments. And even if we think that the probability of war seems remote, cyberspace has enabled a whole host of other hostile activities, short of war, in which an association or over-reliance on ASD could prove undesirable or at the very least costly. Now, whether or not you can sleep at night given over-reliance on the ASD or pixie dust that will solve everything through public-private partnerships depends upon your risk tolerance, perhaps the risk tolerance of your board and your stakeholders. But whatever your risk tolerance is, I'd suggest that if the goal is to keep the lights on in the aftermath of a cyber attack, there is ample room for improvement, both at home and abroad. With that, I'll thank you again for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Frank. Kumar, did you perhaps want to talk to us a little bit about how ready Australian businesses are? You've obviously been involved in advising businesses for many years.
5 minutes, 10 minutes.
We've got plenty of time. So we've got good time for questions at the end. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Hamish. All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to talk to you this morning. Now, what I want to talk to you about is how real is this threat? And almost for the last 20 years, I spent advising businesses, 15 years as a part of a Big Four firm globally, and just to manage security, which was at one time called IT security, and then we renamed it to information protection and business resilience practice. We had 2,000 people worldwide, and I've been on the journey of the so-called IT security than cyber security in the last 20 years. Now, what I do now, the last 5 years, is talk to the boards and the CEOs because they don't know what they don't know. And